President Trump's foreign policy has a lot of world leaders, well, let's just say they're scratching their heads. What are they saying in capital cities around the globe? Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, he joins us to help sort it all out. Also, as Donald Trump keeps playing fast and loose when it comes to facts, the question is, are Republicans getting more and more worried? Then my conversation with the newly installed Archbishop of Newark, Cardinal Tobin, has a lot to say when it comes to the president's immigration crackdown. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. A little bit of everything tonight, this Friday, but we begin with President Trump's foreign policy. At a news conference this week with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the president said the U.S. isn't necessarily committed to a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians. That breaks with decades of U.S. policy. But just hours later, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said U.S. absolutely supports two states. Similar thing happened the week before when it came to Russia. Haley strongly condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine, but hours before, while with the British Prime Minister, the president refused to denounce Russia and he wouldn't even consider additional sanctions. Now, we caught up with Democratic New Jersey Senators Bob Menendez and Cory Booker in D.C. yesterday. They had a lot to say about how the president has dealt with the Russians, including when he compared Russian policy to U.S. policy.
When you say that somehow there's a moral equivalency between us and Russia, that really bothers me, because there's no moral equivalency between a dictator and somebody who kills his adversaries and the United States of America. When you're harsh on our allies like Germany and Australia, but you can't find a challenging word for Putin, that worries me.
We have a nation right now that's invaded Crimea, that's invaded Ukraine, that is causing destabilization in Syria. That nation, which has attacked us, what is the relationship between the Trump administration and that nation? Why is Donald Trump not taking action against the Russians?
Well, just a short time ago, I spoke with Richard Haass. He's president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a former senior Middle East advisor to President George H.W. Bush. He's also author of a new book, A World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order. I'm curious, and certainly a lot of the book apropos of what we're dealing with now, after that 77-minute press conference, what were they saying in capitals like Bonn or in Riyadh, or what were they saying around the world, both friends and allies, and tell the audience why they should care what they were?
Well, the rest of the world is essentially trying to figure out, to get a read on the new American president. He is qualitatively different than anything they've seen before. And what they are concerned about is whether they can expect the kind of continuity and familiar American role in the world. And they're not sure they can. And we've already seen whether it's a phone call with Australia, the confrontation of sorts with Mexico, with China. So there's already a lot of uncertainty. And I think for our allies and friends in particular, this is worrisome because by definition, they depend on us. And if the United States is not there for them, then they ask the question, where then are we? So I think what the press conference did the other day was reinforce the sense that Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, is something qualitatively different than his 44 predecessors.
To that point, I want to read a portion in your book where you speak about what our role in the world can and should be, where you say, in part, the United States has to be wary of a sudden or sharp departure in what it does in the world. Consistency and reliability are essential attributes for a great power. Friends and allies who depend on the United States for their security need to know that this dependence is well placed. And to that end, obviously, the comments the president has made about NATO, the role of nukes in the world, and then also the America First, with a basic premise that we'll put a wall around our country and worry about just the 50 states here. To that end, why would that feeling of protectionism or nationalism be misplaced?
Well, again, for the rest of the world, it raises fundamental questions about whether they can continue to depend on us. And if they conclude they cannot, they'll do one of two things. Either they will essentially defer to the most powerful neighbor, China in Asia, Russia in Europe, and Iran in the Middle East, or they'll decide to take matters into their own hands and perhaps develop, say, nuclear weapons of their own if they feel the United States is not standing behind them. And either way, this is a world that the United States has a lot less influence, It's probably a world there's a lot more conflict. And this is bad for us. The bottom line is whatever else goes on in the rest of the world, it doesn't stay there. The reality of living in the 21st century is nothing stays local for long. Everything gets on the conveyor belt that is globalization. So the United States cannot become a giant gated community. We can't build a moat around us. We will be affected, and for the worse, if there's economic turmoil or war or simply instability elsewhere, whether we're talking the Middle East, Asia, or Europe, or anywhere else.
You know, you talk about in the book how we got here, and you go back several centuries, but to make it more current, two signposts, both the fall of the Berlin Wall and then also the end of the Cold War. You said wherever there was some optimism that some new world order would emerge, didn't really happen according to plan. Talk about what people had hoped versus what's filled its void.
Yeah, 25 years ago, I was actually working at the White House with the then president, 41, George Herbert Walker Bush. He talked about a new world order, a much more peaceful world, a world where, as he called it, the rule of law rather than the rule of the jungle. We had just had the peaceful end of the Cold War on terms that were exceedingly favorable to us. The world then went on to rebuff Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. But what's happened since are a few things. One is power has spread around the world in lots of hands. Groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS have grown up. North Korea now has nuclear weapons. Iran is close. China has gotten a lot stronger. So for all these reasons, plus the end of the Cold War, the world's a messier place with more power in more hands. Then the United States upset the apple cart by some things it did, particularly the 2003 Iraq War. And then subsequently, the United States made things worse by things it didn't do. For example, not acting in Syria after the Syrians used chemical weapons, not following up the invasion of Libya, killing off the global trade agreement after a dozen countries had signed up to it. So this combination of fundamental changes in the world plus American acts of commission and omission have led to a far more disorderly world, what I call a world in disarray. And now, on top of it all, we've got disarray in Washington to a degree we haven't seen. And what really worries me as a longtime observer is this combination of a world that is going through tremendous turmoil and challenge, and the United States, or a U.S. government, that doesn't seem ready, to say the least, to deal with it.
To that end, a question, and I'm fascinated in your perspective, which is, okay, everybody can agree, I would think, regardless of party, that we don't like Russia with the incursion in Crimea. We don't like them messing around with our elections. We certainly don't like them buzzing our ships, let alone having something right off the Connecticut seaboard. But there's been zero in condemnation from the administration, plus all the reports in terms of cooperation, or at least conversations during both the campaign, including with senior members of the Trump administration. Have you seen something like this before? And do you believe that Washington, in the end, puts republic first above politics when it's all said and done to get to the bottom of this?
Well, I sure hope we do. There used to be an expression about the politics stop at the water's edge. And when it comes to matter of foreign policy or national security, this country has to unite, and we can't be Republicans or Democrats anymore, and I hope that's the case. I don't understand why this new administration, and even before it was in power, has been so consistently relaxed about Russian exercise of power, almost benign in their views of Russia. There are some questionable things. You mentioned Ukraine, what the Russians did in Syria. Obviously, they're messing around with American democracy. We should get to the bottom of it. We should find out what these exchanges were about between people in the administration and Russian officials. Even more, or just as important, we need to have a serious policy towards Russia. And that means pushing back against Russian potential aggression in Europe, strengthening NATO. I think we need to do things to strengthen Ukraine. There needs to be a balanced policy towards Russia. It just can't be embraced.
Finally, as you look forward, and as you describe the world in disarray, you write about the concerns regarding North Korea and the devolving Middle East. In terms of national security for this country, what do you think keeps the national security officials up at night, assuming we get the folks in at the NSC we need?
Assuming we have some.
Yeah.
Look, what worries me more than anything over the next couple of years is probably North Korea, in the sense that it will probably reach a point where it can put some nuclear weapons on missiles that can reach the continental United States. but I also worry about terrorists in the Middle East or spreading anywhere, given the ability to hop on an airplane, as we saw in 9/11. I worry about Russian pressure against NATO. I still worry that cyberspace is a pretty much ungoverned area. I got a long list of things that potentially keep me up. And there's a long list of things that will greet this new administration. This is as tough as an inbox as any new president has been met with, I think, in decades. And I just hope this team gets together. We get the right people in place, and they learn how to work together quick, because the world is not going to wait on us forever.
And one of the things, finally, I take away from the book is you can't have an absence of curiosity. You have to be asking questions and be willing to learn, and not come in with some preconceived notions that you've got all the answers. But certainly a lot of them in this, a world in disarray. Richard Haass, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And coming up next, after yet another wild and crazy news conference, people worried about what would happen during a real crisis. Remember, all this stuff is going on in the first 30 days before something has demanded executive action by the president in the face of a real dilemma. Republicans concerned about the guy who's leading their party, and many of us concerned about the man leading our country.